anterior uveitis, a very good number of patients who had idiopathic anterior uveitis, accounting for 160 patients. We also found cases of HLA-B27, herpetic keratouveitis, AIDS-related uveitis, Buschner-Schlossman, JRA, SLE, and non-specific collagen disorders. 19 cases of intermediate uveitis was encountered during the study, out of which 2 were sarcoidosis related. In the posterior uveitis group, majority of the cases were due to toxoplasmosis and TB. Few viral retinochoroiditis cases were encountered, and 1 case of parasitic posterior uveitis due to intraocular hydatidiasis was also encountered. In the panuveitis group, TB and toxoplasmosis again were the major contributing factor diseases. 1 case of leprosy was found in a South Indian male patient. The patient was already a diagnosed case of leprosy and he was already on MDT at the time of presentation. This is a table showing comparing our present study with the prominent studies of the country done in different parts of the country, like Dr. Deepankar Das et al., Vishali Gupta et al., and Dr. Jyotirmoy Biswas et al. We can see from this table that major portion of our patients were having anterior uveitis, nearly 60%, while intermediate and panuveitis was very low. The significant findings of our study were anterior uveitis related with AIDS was a common cause, found in 6% cases, and this may be explained by the fact that Manipur has a high prevalence rate of HIV. And in Japan, a study conducted showed that VKH and races accounted for more common. They were more common than infectious causes like toxoplasmosis, while in our study, VKH and races were absent, and toxoplasmosis was more common. This shows the contrast between developed countries and developing countries. In the present study, 119 cases of posterior uveitis were encountered, out of which 42 cases were diagnosed as due to toxoplasma and TB accounted for 13%. This finding is again in contrast to another study done in North India, where a high number of posterior uveitis was due to TB. Das et al. Conducted a retrospective study in Assam in 2005, and the results of this study showed that anterior uveitis was the most common type, followed by posterior, intermediate, and panuveitis. This finding is similar to the findings in our present study. The limitations of our study was a lack of PCR and a lack of histopathological examination. In conclusion, we can say that the causes of uveitis vary by geographical location around the world. Geographical proximity was found to be a major determinant in the distribution of different forms of uveitis, and the present study highlights the importance of region-specific differential diagnosis. These are my references. Thank you. Based on the lab examination and imaging investigations. Imaging investigations like FFA was done, and ultrasound was done, and lab investigations like doing lab investigations and for modules and ACE levels, HLA-B27 profiling, these were done.
Okay. So you got a quite large number of idiopathic cases in posterior uveitis.
Posterior as well as anterior.
Anterior uveitis.
The study was done in 2012 to 2014. So at that time, those facilities were not available. Thank you.
Uveitis in southern Assam. Is it there?
everyone. My topic is fern-like pattern on ultraviolet field fluorescein angiography across various UIT conditions. To start with, the fern-like pattern on fluorescein angiography represents diffuse capillary leakage, and the finding is considered typical of Behçet's disease. So it represents inadequate therapeutic response during clinically quiescent periods. And the gold standard to detect and monitor both the leaky and the occlusive nature of the retinal vasculitis in Behçet's disease. However, there are a few other non-Behçet's entities where a fur-like pattern can also be present on fluorescein angiography. However, there is sparse literature about those. So, to fill this gap, this study was undertaken. So the study primary objective was to study systemically describe the clinical and imaging characteristics of fern-like pattern on ultra-wide field fluorescein angiography across various UIT conditions. It was a retrospective review of the clinical records of the eyes presenting with fern-like leakage on ultra-wide field fluorescein angiography, and the clinical and imaging characteristics were compared between eyes with Behçet's and the non-Behçet's etiology. So the detailed clinical history, which included the presence of oral ulcer, general ulcer, skin lesions, history of TB, etc. was taken, and the complete ophthalmological evaluation was done, and the anterior segment findings and the posterior segment findings as seen in the uveitis were noted. And these were the findings which were noted on the ultra-wide field fluorescein angiography. The diagnosis of Behçet's was made on the currently used classification, that is the presence of recurrent oral ulcers plus any two of the following, that is skin lesions, recurrent genital ulcers, ocular manifestations of the positive pathologitis, and the diagnosis of TB uveitis was made according to the CORD study. So the total were 23 eyes, and the mean age was 29.58 years, and the distribution was 3 patients of Behçet's disease, 4 patients of tubercular vasculitis, 2 patients with intermediate uveitis, 1 patient with pan-uveitis. He was a 15-year-old child who was actually turned out to be PIK3CD mutation, which I presented in one of the posters, and the 1 recurrent BKH patient, and the exudative retinal detachment, where we could not find out any cause of the exudative detachment. So the bilateral involvement was in 91.67% of the cases. And this is a patient of the tubercular vasculitis, where we can see the perivascular chorotic patches with a fern-like leak, and 1 more patient of TB vasculitis with capillary non-profusion areas in the periphery with fern-like leak and the perivascular chorotic scars. So this was a PIK3CD mutation, a child of pan-uveitis, and this was the exudative detachment. So we can see the fern-like leak only in the area of the exudative detachment, that is inferiorly. And this is a patient of Behçet's uveitis with history of features of this retinitis and fern-like leak again. This was a patient of VKH who had initially presented with the typical symptoms of VKH, that the multiple exudative detachments and the pinpoint leak on FFP. And this is a recurrent, recurrence of the VKH, where unusually we have seen a fern-like leak. So the clinical and the systemic findings which were noted in Behçet's oral and genital ulcer was present, tubercular uveitis, history of TB was present, or immunological or the radiological positive tests were positive, and the perivascular chorotic scars were present. In VKH, SNHL and the vitiligo was present, and minimal findings were seen in intermediate uveitis and the exudative retinal detachment. So these were the anterior segment findings which were seen. So the table showing these findings, what we observed is that in the anterior segment findings, the cells and the posterior synechiae were more in cases of the Behçet's eyes, probably because of the more inflammation. And among the posterior segment findings, the choroiditis was in the non-Behçet's group, and NVT was significant in the Behçet's group. On the ultra-wide field fluorescein angiography, in Behçet's group, this NVT was significant, and the disc hyperfluorescence was present in cases of the Behçet's disease. So, to the best of our knowledge, this is the first study to investigate the fern-like leak on ultra-wide field angiography in Behçet's disease versus non-Behçet's etiology, and the hyperfluorescence of the optic disc was a significant findings in the Behçet's disease in our study, which is similar to the Mesquida et al. And Quiroquina et al. Studies. And we speculate that the increased incidence of optic disc hyperfluorescence in Behçet's disease is probably due to the increased severity of the disc. And so the clinical implication is it is not exclusive to the Behçet's, occur in multiple EYD conditions. Thank you.
So, what was the take-home message? Because in the significant findings also, hyperfluorescence, so all these are non-specific findings. So where does your paper take us? Like, what do we, what is the take-home message from your paper?
So what and then interacted with others also, and in fact the literature also. The moment we see a fern-like pattern on this surface, we start jumping carrying into Behçet's. So the message is it is not Behçet's. The messages it can be seen in the various other entities, and if you see the literature, if you because a lot of the literature research was also done thereafter. So it is very rarely it is given that it is. I mean, we know, but it has not been documented in the literature that it is seen in these conditions also.
Treatment
Yeah,
pattern, you changed your anything?
The treatment is treatment remains same. Like when it's a patient, you start the patient on double immunosuppression, or maybe you can start on the biologics directly. However, the misdiagnosis, like some people will say this is one pattern. No, then they make up their mind towards the patient's disease, and they start taking the history. You have ulcers, and you can make the wrong diagnosis even the patient says get over. So the take-home message is that do not come to the conclusion of the patients because of the wrong pattern, and it can be seen in all entities.
So basically, get your treatment pattern.
It affects the treatment.
Or any outcome you difference you noticed during no. Because non-uveitic cases also sometimes we notice Behçet's pattern. Even if we can remember the CRP also, in late cases, if you notice there is these leakages and also leukemia also sometimes present.
Yeah, in fact, there is a paper.
So, that's all I wanted to know, is it, does it affected your outcome or what you found in the study? Thank you, nice documentation. Outcome of anti-Young laser capsulotomy in patients with uveitis by Dr. Rasmi Nanda. Okay, you can.
Good morning to all the panel members and my colleagues. The topic of my paper today is outcomes of YAG laser capsulotomy in patients with uveitis. We do not have any financial interest. Background: the outcomes of YAG laser capsulotomy in patients with uveitis and coexistent ocular comorbidities like glaucoma and cystoid macular edema are not well known. Aim of our study was to evaluate the visual outcomes after capsulotomy and to study the rate of complication as well after capsulotomy in uveitis patients. 102 eyes of 102 patients with uveitis who had YAG laser capsulotomy between December 2020 to April 2022 were retrospectively evaluated, and informed consent was obtained from all subjects based on Declaration of Helsinki, and research protocol was approved by the Institutional Ethics Committee. Inclusion criteria included age above 18 years and a minimum inflammation-free period of 3 months, which was defined as less than 5 cells per high power field. And exclusion criteria included follow-up less than 9 months and pre-existing retinal pathologies like retinal detachment and diabetes. Outcomes were documented at 3rd, 6th, 9th and 12th months after the capsulotomy was done. The parameters which we noted was the type of surgery, cataract surgery, the IOL material, duration between cataract surgery and capsulotomy, history of glaucoma and cystoid macular edema, total YAG energy used, cells and flare in AC, intraocular pressure, IOL pitting, development or exacerbation of previous cystoid macular edema and retinal detachment. Results.
etiology of uveitis, we saw that in majority of cases, 46 patients had the etiology. In 46 patients, the etiology was mostly idiopathic. In 12, it was fused heterochromatic iridocyclitis, followed by HLA-B27 associated uveitis, then tuberculosis, sarcoidosis, multiple sclerosis, herpetic, and toxoplasmosis. The baseline characteristics which we noted were the mean age varied from 48 plus minus 12. Type of surgery which included phacoemulsification group, there was 42 patients, and in SICS 60 patients. Type of IOD in acrylic group 44 patients, and for PMMA 58. Baseline IOP which was recorded was 16.8 plus minus 8. And glaucoma on treatment, there were 2 patients in this group, and history of cystoid macular edema, 12 patients were present. Mean energy used, mean YAG energy used was 86 millijoule, which ranged from 40 to 140 millijoule. And mean interval between the cataract surgery was 18 months, ranging from 4 to 40 months. And the follow-up period was between 14 plus minus 10 months. 5 patients in phaco group and 4 patients in SICS group had persistent uveitis at 1 month, and out of these 6 patients developed cystoid macular edema, and after treatment they had resolution and CME subsequently in 4 eyes. 21 patients developed a rise in intraocular pressure after laser, and out of these 6 had sustained rise of IOP and were referred to glaucoma clinic for further management. Visual outcomes after 12 months, we saw an improvement in 72 patients, which was like BCVA 6/6. And in 26 patients, we did not see any improvement. The vision remained same. And in 4%, we saw a reduction in best corrected visual acuity. And the reason for no improvement basically were development of cystoid macular edema, macular degeneration, IOL deposits, glaucomatous optic atrophy, macular hole, and in 1 patient we were not able to find any reason in 1 patient. Reason for worsening of vision was we saw that there was persistence of vitreous cell and nuanced cystoid macular edema, which led to worsening of the case. Improvement in visual acuity after capsulotomy, we saw in 20 patients there was improvement with 1 Snellen's line, then in 16 patients up to 2 Snellen's line, in 8 patients up to 3 Snellen's line, in 10 patients up to 4, in 18 patients up to 5, and in 26 patients it remains same and worsened. The take-home message is that pre-existing cystoid macular edema and persistent cellular activity in vitreous are the main causes of poor visual gain after YAG capsulotomy, and in these patients, capsulotomy should be performed with caution. These are my references. Thank you. Detachment, other retinal pathology. Ma'am, we did a follow-up at 3, 6.
Did it 3?
Ma'am, no ma'am. The same day as well. I did the same day, then at 7-day interval, and that after that 3, 6, 9.
And you mentioned that at 1 month there was persistent uveitis in cases.
Ma'am, some patients come to follow. We basically call patients at 7, then at 1 month, then 3rd, 6th, but I have mentioned in this that 3, 6, 9.
And this is what extra precautions you took in such cases. In a case of uveitis,
Yes, ma'am.
if the patient is to be posted, YAG capsule.
Yes.
So what extra precautions you take in such patients?
Ma'am, basically, so we evaluate the patient first with slit lamp, and we see the peripheral retina, peripheral fundus, and
Any change in medications?
ma'am, we give to lower the IOP, we give Timolol as well after week 2 and everything.
Did you have those? Are you classifying them also as PCO or even on the anterior surface of the IOL? That is more common actually.
Yes.
They get these deposits. Did you also look at those?
No, ma'am. Okay, we're just looking at the PCO.
Let's go to the types of uveitis, the frequency.
Idiopathic.
After that was first.
So what is your take-home message?
Ma'am, the take-home message is that mostly the mean energy level that we use, initial and then the mean energy level should be lower in specifically in cases of uveitis because it causes much more complication. Like the higher the energy level we use, higher is the rate of complications.
I think you were mentioned on pre-existing edema, your last slide. So we have noted here pre-existing macular edema and persistent cellular activity. So you post those cases for your capsulotomy.
Now, if they have mostly though we don't post those cases. If they have, then we exclude them.
So that is an exclusion criteria rather. Second thing what I wanted to know, whenever you are telling cataract surgery, was it just single episode anterior uveitis and then it's a normal phaco cataract, or it is a complicated cataract which was operated beforehand? Did you classify them, which cataract surgery patients you took?
Basically, this was the general, it was not complicated or.
So these are all normal phaco, they are not complicated cataract.
Yes, ma'am.
So any, this is your study type was, which study?
Retrospective.
Retrospective. So there is no control you compared with controlled capsulotomy? Thank you.
Because that would have a bearing on your findings and your statistical analysis. So all these cases were just on topical steroids, that's it. None of them was on new systemic conditions were associated with the uveitis, and none of these patients were on any systemic steroids or any IMT. Or maybe you didn't look into that.
So actually, it was a retrospective study, so I just took the data and.
Okay, but was that data available about systemic disease and disease modifying agents? Because that has a bearing,
Good afternoon, esteemed jury. My name is Dr. Saibitra Mishra from Bangalore, Narayan Meghalaya, working as a consultant in the Department of Uveitis and Ocular Immunology. So, COVID vaccines were developed to protect us against the COVID infection by primarily inducing viral neutralizing antibodies. However, it was not without its unintended adverse effects. The vaccination trials did try to have detailed evaluation of the immune responses to the vaccines because safety was critical. However, after the widespread vaccination, post-marketing surveillance reported growing occurrences of post-vaccination ocular inflammation. So this is a retrospective case series of hospital data from a tertiary eye care center over a 3-month period. The study population was those patients who presented with ocular inflammation following COVID vaccination, where the symptoms arose within 8 weeks of vaccination and had a minimum follow-up of 3 months. The data collected included demographics, vaccination details, ocular history, and treatment and outcomes. The ethical committee approval was obtained and statistical analysis was performed. We had a total of 67 eyes, 56.7% were males. The mean age was 43 years and onset was noted to be about 25 days. Bilateral involvement was noted in 43.3% cases. It was noted that over 70% patients presented with symptoms within 1 month of vaccination. Our patients received one of 4 vaccines, that is the Covishield, which is a spike protein subunit vaccine, or Covaxin, which is a whole inactivated viral vaccine, Sputnik, which was a viral vector vaccine, and Pfizer, an mRNA vaccine. 56 patients, that is 83% of our study population, had received the Covishield vaccine, followed by Covaxin, and only a small proportion of the patients had the Pfizer and Sputnik vaccines. We noted de novo or first-time inflammation in 42% patients and recurrence of previously present inflammation in 58% patients. Interesting was to note that after the first dose we had more of de novo inflammation, and after the second dose we had more of recurrence of the previously present inflammation, possibly because of the booster effect of the vaccine. Coming to anatomical classification, majority of the patients had anterior uveitis that was about 42%, followed by panuveitis, but we did not find any statistically significant association between the type of vaccine and the anatomical diagnosis. In etiological diagnosis, we had again a major chunk of patients, that is 46% with idiopathic inflammation, but autoimmune related diseases were encountered in 31%, and an infectious etiology was found in about 23% patients. There was a statistically significant association between vaccine dose and the etiological disease, and this may suggest that on further booster dose, some of the vaccines may trigger inflammation to cause a specific etiology of inflammation, such as viral or even idiopathic. After the first dose, the most frequent etiologies was idiopathic, also IgG mycotism and viral uveitis. After the second dose, there was a significant increase in the number of idiopathic cases. Viral reactivation was noted in both the subgroups. Treatment was conventional with the use of corticosteroids and immunosuppressive therapy based on the severity of inflammation or the type of etiology. And most of the patients had good visual outcomes, except for those with cystoid macular edema, choroidal atrophy, optic atrophy, or acute retinal necrosis. The ocular inflammation mechanisms is still unclear, and the hypothesized pathways involve both the adaptive and innate immune systems, including molecular mimicry, T-cell response, and cytokine production. Potential triggers would also be due to the adjuvants used in vaccine preparation. Similar to other studies published at the time, we had patients with majority with anti-uveitis. However, they noted a mean onset much earlier because they studied patients within only about 2 weeks of vaccination, and there are multiple reports of viral reactivation after their vaccination. The retrospective design on a small sample size make it difficult to establish a definitive causative relationship between the vaccine and ocular inflammation. Nonetheless, the clinician should be vigilant about the possibility of this, and even though the causality is only speculative. Our study offers valuable insights into the common and rare ocular inflammatory complications post-COVID-19 vaccination, enhancing recognition of vaccine reaction patterns, and understanding this immune dysregulation and the possibility of ocular inflammation post-vaccination will help in vaccine safety monitoring and immunization strategy in pandemics. We had tuberculosis and viral ARN.
Like serpiginous choroiditis is a very common finding that you see after vaccination, which I noticed you did not have.
Yes, when we had tuberculosis, I was reported as TB SLC and treated with the TB category in patients.
TB. And another thing, how long did you follow up these patients? Did you see recurrences in these patients again? Like how long was your follow-up of these patients after you started treatment?
So as per the study, the patient needed a minimum of 3 months follow-up, which was sufficient to tackle the recurrence or the removal inflammation. Within 3 months, we could understand the outcome for the study. But yes, there were 2 patients who had reactivation after the second dose as well, as I mentioned in one of the slides.
No, what I meant to ask you was a late recurrence. Like once you treated these patients, did you see the recurrence coming in again after a few months? How? That's what I wanted to know your follow-up. Did you follow them up?
Not in the study, but it's in the sense that these patients, their immunosuppressive therapy was heightened after the vaccination, so probably they wouldn't have had an immediate recurrence noted on follow-up.
There are some criteria which are there to establish causality. So did you look into those criteria? Because it could just be a coincidental finding that COVID vaccine, because at that time everyone was getting COVID and everybody was getting COVID vaccinations. So do you know anything about those criteria? Various studies have reported various criteria for establishing causality of.
Also, but our number and also the subgroup numbers were very small to establish, and even if we put anatomical classification or ecological classification, the numbers were very small to go into to establish causality.
There are some very good studies by the Carlos Covezio group, one in 2022 and one in 2024. This one where he has delved into the causality of hepatitis post-COVID vaccination.
So they have the MHC1 and TH1 and TH17 pathways, which one is for the viral reactivations, which is more common, and also the TB is explained in the TH17, but we did not have, this was done actually in the first half when the vaccination had started and we saw patients coming in. So I think ad hoc analysis will help us.
After the first dose. So, were they advised not to take the second dose?
Yes, ma'am. We did not say not to take the second dose, but we were very speculative that they may get a recurrence, and we did call them out for a follow-up, but they did not have the patients in our study did not have. Only 2 patients had inflammation after the second dose as well. The other patients did not.
You called up the patients after the
Yes, we
second
asked them
dose.
We had called them for the review after because they did ask us, can we take the second dose? And there was no, at that time, systemic management and safety from COVID was more critical than the ocular inflammation, because again, majority of our patients had only anti-uveitis and they all had good visual outcomes, except for the macular pathologies and optic atrophy. So we do not tell anybody not to take vaccine.
So they all responded only to the topical therapy.
No, ma'am. Depending on the etiology, we did treat them like whom we diagnosed with TB, uveitis, we treated them with LTT, and viral uveitis, all of them, the patients we haven't received intravitreal calcium. And the antiseptic inflammation, uveitis, or only anti-uveitis, we give them oral varicella.
So what was the recurrence rate? Especially in AR and ALS.
No, I think the patient with AR did not take his second dose. It was an elderly patient with poor outcomes. So I think he did not take the second dose, and he said he will he deferred the second dose by himself.
No, it's not only about the dose.
Okay,
But
ma'am.
you can see recurrences or even in the anterior uveitis.
No, ma'am.
We are just speculating that this is because of the COVID only.
Yes, no, ma'am. We did not have recurrences, and possibly that is why we included these as an idiopathic only post-COVID vaccination. They did not find any etiology and did not have any recurrences. Yes, as per the study, within 3 months.
3 months
So
is
again,
not a period
I
for,
can-
you cannot say that the patient had no recurrence.
Yes, so then
Yeah.
Also, did you take into account like COVID, infection? Like, did you factor in whether the patient had, apart from the vaccination, prior COVID, infection? Because there are major studies from the UK, population-based studies, in which they found did you measure anti-COVID antibodies in these patients?
yes, so that
You did.
but not in the true sense of anti-COVID antibodies, but patients who had had COVID within 3 months were not eligible for the vaccination at the time as per the rules. So
Yeah.
none of the patients had COVID within 3 months. So only bias would be if a patient had received the vaccine and then also had a COVID infection.
So there were major studies from the UK in which they have shown that if there was a prior COVID infection, in those people, the antibody levels which were they checked were very high compared to those who had not had the infection. So post-vaccine, even the first dose of vaccine, if they had prior COVID infection, their antibody levels were much higher. So those studies are very important when you are kind of analyzing this kind of uveitis. So look into that as well.
So definitely for the future studies, probably we should guide the the management that prior to receiving the vaccination, antibody is responsible.
By Dr. Aarti Rajkumar. One more present here. I'll be speaking about the clinical profile of patients with uveitis developing peripapillary choroidal neovascular membrane. So inflammatory CNVM is a rare complication associated with intraocular inflammation. Peripapillary CNVM is characterized by formation of new vessels between the inner collagenous layer of the Bruch's membrane and the outer sensory retina located within 1 disc diameter of the margin of the optic nerve head. Because of the anatomical location, PP-CNVM can be asymptomatic initially and become symptomatic later on with macular involvement. There are usually occult membranes and can pose significant diagnostic and therapeutic challenges. So we conducted a retrospective analysis in a uveitis clinic of a tertiary eye hospital between January 2015 to December of 2019. Patients with inflammatory peripapillary CNVM were included in the study, and patients with CNVM due to other causes like trauma, degenerative diseases were excluded from the study. So there were 29 eyes of 20 patients. 45% of the patients showed bilateral disease. There was no gender predilection in our study. The most common cause of peripapillary CNVM in our study was multifocal choroiditis, which was 40%, followed by VKH, which was 25%. The most common symptom was diminution of vision, 95%, and pain, which was 35%. The mean age of the patients was 35.4 years, between the ranges of 12 to 51 years. The duration between the onset of uveitis and diagnosis of CNVM in days was 51.5, and the duration of follow-up was 1,533 days. So the number of inactive cases that developed CNVM were 10, and the number of active cases developing CNVM were also 10. All patients received steroids, 12 patients received immunomodulator therapy, and 4 patients received ATT. The most common anti-VEGF that was used for the treatment of the CNVM was bevacizumab, followed by ranibizumab. 22.6% of the involved eyes showed no recurrence, and 16.1% had only 1 recurrence of the CNVM. Only 1 patient had more than 3 recurrences. Most common complication found in our study was raised intraocular pressure, which was evident in 57.1% of the patients. Coming to the discussion, peripapillary choroiditis is the most common location for developing a CNVM. Possible mechanisms are widening of the potential space between the Bruch's membrane and swollen optic disc due to chronic inflammation, and deformation of the peripapillary Bruch's membrane due to chronic disc edema, leading to a break in the Bruch. In our study, the most common non-infectious cause of peripapillary CNVM was multifocal choroiditis, followed by VKH. In other studies, VKH and punctate inner choroidopathy was reported as the most common cause. Tuberculosis was the only infectious cause found in our study as compared to tuberculosis and toxoplasmosis in other studies. Our study also shows no gender predilection as compared to other studies. Posterior uveitis is most prone for developing CNVM, either active or inactive conditions. So activity of the underlying inflammatory condition is not necessary to develop a choroidal neovascular membrane. Peripapillary CNVM has a tendency to extend either around the optic disc or towards the macula. Hence, it is essential to manage these patients prior to the extension of the lesion and to prevent irreversible damage. Bevacizumab was the most commonly used anti-VEGF to treat the CNVM. The reason behind such an inclination could be because of the cost factor and also its easy availability, which can cater to most of the Indian population. D'Souza et al. In their study also found a predilection for peripapillary location of the CNVM as against the Western population. As I said, only 1 eye had more than 3 recurrences in the disease course, and the rate of recurrence reduced after instituting immunosuppressive therapy. This case highlights the role of immunosuppression in peripapillary CNVM, at least to reduce the recurrence as well as the complication rate. Currently, there are no guidelines for their use. Most common complication found in our study was raised intraocular pressure, which could either be due to steroid response or due to multiple intraocular infections. The limitations was that it was a retrospective study design and it was included in a tertiary eye hospital where all patients were referable. Coming to the conclusion, peripapillary CNVM is a serious complication associated with any uveitic condition.
Early recognition and timely appropriate management is the mainstay of treatment. Till date, there have been numerous studies on diagnostic as well as management challenges of peripapillary CMVM, but there is no study on the clinical profile of the patients at risk of developing such complications from India. This NICE study is the first from South India elaborating the clinical profile of such patients at risk. However, the role of immunosuppressive agents is yet to be studied in detail by randomized prospective large-scale studies. These are my references. Thank you.
Do you have any pictures to show? Any UCT angiography pictures?
I didn't include them in the presentation. I didn't include them in the presentation.
And how did you diagnose the CMVM?
Using OCT angiography.
So have you mentioned that in your protocol? That's very important. In the methodology. So it's an important study, but just mentioning or showing one picture, we would complete the picture.
How big were the CMVMs? How far did it from the disc? Peripapillary doesn't mean, were they amenable to laser? If they were, did you think of the laser in any way? All those things, they would be more highlighted if you show some pictures in your diagnostic protocols.
So immunosuppressive agents were given systemically or
Systemically.
you have any experience of giving intraocular steroids or anything because it is an intravenous treatment. Suppose
Like giving
case reports are there, but if it is a non-responding case, if you use intraocular immunosuppressive like steroids or anything, then it depends.
None of our patients had.
Another thing is, I don't know whether it is, but it is said that bevacizumab has anti-inflammatory activity also. So that's why in cases of uveitis, so it is preferable over another individual. Not on the
cross back.
Just go back to the slides. You said, which one? Yeah, this one. So only one eye had more than 3 recurrences. This, you're talking about the recurrences
Of CMVM.
uveitis or
No, not
CMVM?
CMVM, not uveitis.
Once you had the CMVM, you started immunosuppressives. What about the patients who started on immunosuppressives before, like for PTH, we start the patient on immunosuppressives beforehand. So did you study the difference between patients who were on immunosuppressives and then developed CMVM and patients who were not on?
I didn't get the question.
How many patients were already taking immunosuppressives? Patients who developed CMVM?
12 patients were already on it, but only 10 of them had active disease. So the remaining were actually on like maintenance therapy.
So did you increase the dose of immunosuppression in those cases? Like the cases which were on maintenance immunosuppression?
Yes, so
The dose was escalated.
Yes, the dose was.
What do you think was the cause of CMVM in those cases which were inactive?
The pre-existing condition could have caused a damage in that area which could have led to the,
Can you be precise?
there could have been like a localized break in the Bruch's membrane which could have led to
And you can expect that, right? Your most common condition was MFC. So what does it cause? So you have to try to think also. When you're presenting, try to think what is happening also. Right? So it will cause a thinning of the choroid.
which can lead to.
Yeah, so there's through the Bruch's membrane, breaks in the Bruch's membrane, the CMVM can develop. Why peripapillary? So that you have put it
Why
at a
then?
point.
Because the edema there was causing.
What is the other location which has a predilection for CMVM development? In any case, even uveitis. And why?
The macular area.
The fovea.
The fovea, because it's
Why? Because it's the thinnest part.
thinnest part of the.
So what is the time duration you followed these cases? As it is a retrospective study.
So from 20.
So like how many anti-VEGF or how many, the follow-up of these patients?
They were followed up actually until very recently only, like the beginning of
Like
2024.
minimum
And-
duration, minimum duration you followed up.
Oh, like how frequently we call, we actually.
No, your is retrospective study. So included those patients who has completed follow-up for how many month, a year, or what?
No, we included patients between 2015 to 2019. After that, they have been on follow-up. Like after, like only till 2019 the patient.
Like where you mentioned pre-recurrence. So that patient might have followed up for something, that your follow-up period was fixed or not? Like each uveitis patient who will follow up 6 months or 1 year, your inclusion criteria mentioned that? Or?
It's very important to name it.
Because you have also mentioned the 10 cases during active disease and 10 cases. So were you sure that those cases after uveitis you developed CMPA or? Because inclusion criteria and methods need to be very
Robust.
strict.
They have to be very robust. Otherwise,
Just skimmed over those. Those were the most important ones. You will concentrate on the discussion. Also, how many of these patients require more than one anti-VEGF? Because you see that these patients respond pretty well to even a single injection.
Yes, ma'am. Most of them actually
It's not
received only
mentioned
one.
how many.
No, actually they were injected only when they developed the recurrence. So most of them did not develop a recurrence. They were injected only that one time and then it was stopped. And they were just like kept on maintenance steroids and immunosuppressants. But after they were not injected with anti-VEGF.
you need fewer injections than AMD patients.
Then AMD patients, yes.
Thank you. So we are left with two talks at the present, Dr.